G'day everyone, welcome to New Tech. My name is Miles and thanks very much for watching. In today's video, we're going to be looking at relief carving in Fusion 360. So let's get started. So after my last vbit carving video in Fusion 360, I had some questions about how to remove the islands that appear in the center of the carving. And so in today's video, I'm going to be covering two different techniques for achieving this. The first technique will be using a dual layer piece of timber, and the second one will be carving directly into your stock itself. So for this technique today, I'll be purely using the 90-degree vbit tool. Now this is great for starters, and it's certainly one of those ones that you should be having as your go-to vbit engraving. I also use a 60-degree vbit. Now I'm going to be basing today's tutorial off the 90-degree vbit because it's really easy to calculate your different angles on a 90-degree slope. So let's jump over the computer and get started with today's tutorial. Okay, just before we get started with the tutorial today, well, I just wanted to show you I have made my mouse a lot larger and made it red so you can see it at all times. And I've also got a keystroke logger in the far corner, so if I press spacebar it comes up as a blank, or any other keys should come out as different letters there, and then escape. So that might assist you with today's tutorial to make sure you can see what I'm doing on my keyboard. So before I get started in Fusion 360, I thought I'd take you through how I prepare my artworks using Illustrator to create my DXF files. So let's jump across to Illustrator there. The first thing is that we need to start off by creating a new file. And what's really important when we create a new file in Illustrator is that we're using the same measurement units that we're using in Fusion 360. So you can see here that I've already selected millimeters, and the size of my stock that I'll be using is 200 millimeters by 200 millimeters square, and go ahead and click create. Now that just ensures that when I do export it as a DXF that it's kind of talking the same format or same units there, that it's easy to convert across. So I'll be using a PNG of my logo today. I've already had that in the clipboard there. So I've copied that and pasted it there. You can see that it's come out really nicely. It's nice and sharp, it's high resolution. And what I'm going to do is go ahead and trace that image. Now, if you don't have the option above here, so you can see it says image trace at the top, you can also find that down on object, then go down to image trace and then go make. Okay, so when we make that image trace, you can see that it goes through and traces that quite nicely. I have got some strange artifact down there. I'm going to see if I can get rid of that by just changing some of these. Threshold looks good, looks like it fixed it there. Whoops. Okay, that looks pretty good to me. Now, the very last thing, if you don't have this option available, you just make sure you click the image trace panel there to make it appear. You'll find that there's an advanced menu down here. If you just click that arrow down, you can find that we can get rid of a lot of that white that we don't need for this, this DXF. So I'll just go ignore white. You can see that the white turns directly to a transparent color, and then we're just left with the black part. So I'm really happy with the artwork. It's nice and crisp and clean, so I'm going to go ahead and expand that into line work, and now we have our vector that I'm going to resize down to the correct size that I need it at. It's just a bit smaller than the stock itself. I'm really happy with that, and I'll just convert it to lines by swapping the layers from fill to lines so I can see what I've got left. So I'm really happy with that. I'm going to now export it as a DXF file. So go down to, go up to File, then go down to Export, then go Save As. Now here I should have a DXF option, which I do, and I'm going to save that in my tutorial for this. And I'm going to call this New Tech Logo DXF. Fantastic. Save that and just make sure it's saved as it's under the 2018. That's fine. Scale of 1 millimeters to 1 unit is correct, and the rest of the settings I'll keep as is. So go OK, and that should export it fine from there. Okay, so we can now jump across to Fusion 360 and begin designing our stock. So let's start with creating a new sketch, and we're going to do it on the base there so I can look down towards that. I'm going to start with a rectangle and click on the origin there. Now I did say this was 200 millimeters by 200 millimeters in the units that we're using for this. Whoops, not sure what happened there. I'll go again. So rectangle 200 by 200 and then click enter. Okay, so I have my dimensions there ready to go. I'll go finish sketch, and we're going to extrude that by clicking the E button on the keyboard. And I'm going to extrude this, is going to be 18 millimeters. Now, the reason for this is because, as I was showing you, this first tutorial will be on a split surface. So using two pieces of, I'm using two pieces of 9 millimeter ply. So I've just made this height twice the height of that 9 millimeter to make it 18 millimeters altogether. So the next thing is that we're going to import that DXF on top of the artwork. So quite simply, we just go up to Insert, go down to Insert DXF, and we'll go ahead and select the surface we're going to put it on, which is the top surface there. And we're going to find that file that I saved. So let's go into... Okay, so now I've imported that DXF. I just need to center that. Okay, there. And what I'm hoping for is it to throw an error, because this is one really common issue that I have found on Fusion 360 is sometimes when you do import vector line work, that it does sometimes cause an error when it's closing gaps. So if I put my mouse over that area, you can see that it fills in the gaps which are closed off, and you can see that this line over here is not connecting for some reason. That means there's a slight little gap somewhere in that line, but sometimes it's way too small to be able to see. So I'm going to show you how to fix that issue up, because we can't use the Engraved toolpath until that's correctly closed off. So let's jump into that artwork. So right click down here on the last sketch that I did and go Edit Sketch. Now, quite simply, to close it off, all I'm going to do is to we'll click the shortcut, sketch shortcut menu by clicking S, and then I'm going to use the offset. Now, the reason why I'm using offset is that when we reduce it, and I'm going to reduce it by 0.1 of a millimeter, when we reduce it actually closes that shape smaller and then closes any gaps that might be open that we can't see. So I'm just going to go OK. And now, voila, we can now see that there is a closed gap here, and we can't see any differences within the artwork from what we need to. 0.1 is really not a massive difference to use. You can make it even smaller than that if you want to. So I'm really happy with the artwork now. We've fixed any issues with it, and the last thing we need to do is just go ahead and extrude that down. Now I'm going to extrude it by 9 millimeters, so I'll go -9 because that's the size of the material that we're going to need to cut through to make it through that first top layer, and then go ahead and click OK. So obviously it depends on the thickness that you're using. You can use any size that you need to, as long as that your vbit can dive down that deep. Okay, so I'm really happy with the artwork so far and what I've modeled up, and now we're ready to jump across to the manufacturing tab. So down in the manufacture tab, we're going to do a new setup. We're going to create, that's going to be the model, which is the body, and the stock point, I always tend to use the bottom right hand corner for any of the reference points, and then I don't tend to put any additional stock on. I just put it as is and then go ahead and click OK. So this first part will be very simple. You've probably set up the Engraved toolpath before, so I'm going to go ahead and just select the Engraved toolpath. Then I've already selected or I've already set up the 90-degree vbit, so this works on a 45-degree angle. This is a 22 millimeter diameter bit. Go select. I'm going to change a couple of values here. So my spindle is actually, I have manual control over it. I rather do that than have it set in the program. UGS doesn't allow on the fly to change the RPM, so I like to do that manually, so it doesn't really matter what I put my spindle speed on at the moment. I'm just going to put this as surface speed as 2700, and the cutting feed rate I'll leave as 2400. That's fine. Now I'll change my No, I'll just leave those, sorry. Okay, I'll go across to the next tab. Now the contour selection, all I need to do is select the top surface. I don't need to select the base surface for the Engraved toolpath. However, I will need that bottom selection later on. So I'll go ahead and select that. Looks pretty good. And then I'll go through to this one. Now, I need to tell my vbit where to stop. So I need to tell it where to come down to and stop here. Because in these large areas, what the vbit will tend to do is just dive as deep as it can. So I need to kind of create some a barrier or place for the vbit to stop so it doesn't go through too far into the next layer of material. So what I'm going to do is, for the bottom height of my stock, I'm going to do this as a selection. So I'm going to go ahead and select that surface down there, which is good, that's the face. Now the offset, because I've added some tape in between both of these layers to keep them together, double-sided tape, that takes up about a 0.6 to 0.8 millimeters of a difference. But what I'm going to do is put this as a minus, let's put it as -1. And the reason for that is that I actually want it to go all the way through, down through the tape that I've got down here, and then just kind of kiss the surface underneath. And that's really important, because if I've got an artwork which has many separate pieces, I want to know a reference to where I need to glue them later on. So it's really important that I do a slight extension through that. It might be a bit too aggressive, 0.1. I might put it down maybe, let's say 0.8. So I'm really happy with that. It's going to go through and just kiss that base surface and draw an outline of where my artwork needs to be re-glued down to later on. Now in the passes, I'm just going to leave this as is. I'm not going to put multiple depths on. However, this is quite aggressive, going through the 9mm ply using the 45-degree end mill. So I'll see how I go. It is ply, so it should cut through it pretty easily, pretty well, and no settings to change in this last tab here. Go click OK. Alright, so that's gone through quite easily. You can actually see that that dives down and goes through that base part, which I wanted to, so it's going to go through and start scoring that underneath layer. Some of these parts will not dive through because that 90-degree angle doesn't exceed the depth of that material. So I'm really happy so far how that's looking. What I'm going to do is export that now as the toolpath and jump down to my machine and see how that looks. I'm super impressed on how this one turned out. Obviously that there's going to be some issues if you have floating pieces that you need to carve out. They might dislodge through the carving, so it's really important to make sure that you keep an eye on these parts and make sure that the sticky tape, the double-sided sticky tape that you use, is certainly strong enough to hold those parts down. So there's some ways that you can use this really well, and then some ways that you might choose to do the other version instead. The other thing I quite like is because I went an extra 0.2 millimeters down into my stock, it did engrave the outline of where I need to place my my carving at the end, but I didn't choose to use this underneath. However, this will be a great guide for you to follow if you need to place different parts down back onto your main background stock. So let's jump over to Fusion 360 and check out how version 2 is achieved. Okay, so the second part of this tutorial, we're going to be using a solid stock, so we're going to need to add on to the toolpath that I've got at the moment. So what I'm going to do is just going to delete the toolpath that I did have here. So I'm going to go through and go delete, and we're going to reset up this. So I'm going to leave the setup as is, so which is fine. I'm going to leave the artwork as is, but I'm just going to put a new engrave toolpath there. I'm going to go ahead and select my 90-degree vbit that I had before, and just make sure those settings are correct, which I'm pretty happy about. I might put this up to 2700. I could probably go much higher than that, but because I want this to look quite nice and no major jitters or imperfections in the cutting area, I'll keep it quite slow for today's tutorial. So going across to the geometry, I'm going to go ahead once again and select just that top geometry for the V-bit to come through and cut out. Now, this is going to be a little bit different to my previous technique. I'm still going to select the bottom selection there, but I'm not going to have an offset, so I'm going to keep that as 0. So it's going to, the V-bit's only going to reach down to this surface here. And then in the passes, I'm actually going to do this as a multiple depth. So I know that's 9 millimeters deep, so I might just do the maximum step down as 4 millimeters, because that will almost reach halfway there. It will just stop any deflection or any issues with the tool bit diving too far into your piece of material too quickly. So I'm going to do that in 2 different passes, and going to leave that as is. Go OK. Okay, you can see here that that's cut really nicely, but the issue is when you do this engraved toolpath, if you're using this new technique that I'm doing today, we have all these islands that we need to get rid of. So that's quite simple to get rid of, because we're going to come in here with a 3.175 millimeter flat end mill, and we're going to come in here and clear this away. But one of the things is that we need to keep away from exceeding this area where the V-bit comes down. And so I'm going to go through today on how I set up my toolpath to avoid it kind of crashing into these slopes on the side of the text. So we're going to go ahead and create a pocket, a 2D pocket. Now I'm going to go ahead and select the tool that I'll be using for today. So that's the 3.175 flat end mill, and go select. Okay, and I could probably go quite aggressive into this. I'll put 2700 for the moment. Now I'm going to put the ramp feed rate as 1200, and whoops, don't need cap. And then do a let's say 800 plunge, even though there's no plunges in this one, that's fine. Go ahead, the pocket selection, I'm going to be clearing out this area here, but as you can see here, it's not recognizing the 45-degree angle. So I've just got a quick diagram here to show you what I'm about to do. With the V-bit here, we can see that we're going to be using a 45-degree angle to this angle on the corner here. And this is where the V-bits come down to at the moment. So we essentially just need my flat end mill to come up to this line. Now, if I just show, I've done another layer here. I'm going to unlock that. So essentially what happens is the V-bit comes down and cuts into this area, and we know these dimensions already. So we know we've already gone down 9mm. We know that this is a 45-degree angle. So we know that the border or the boundary around where that V-bit has touched on the base surface is also 9mm. And that's why I really like using the 90-degree V-bit to do a lot of my carving, because it's super easy to figure out your width of the border. So with that said, let's go ahead. We're going to be doing, let's have a look. Yep, okay, so we're going to go down to the bottom height once again. So we're going to go selection and click on there just to make sure that that's the same surface as we use for the base of the V-bit. And then in the passes, we're going to do a stock to leave. Now, the first radial one is how much stock is it going to leave from touching the walls. So we've already established that that is 9mm. We've gone 9mm down, so it's also 9mm of a border. And then the axial stock, which is the vertical axis, we're actually going to leave that as 0. So we want it to go down and touch that base. We don't want it to have an offset from that stock there. And I'm going to leave the rest of the settings pretty much as is, and then go click OK. And hopefully with that magic, we can see that we've done pretty well so far. So it's been able to establish that it's this area around here that we need to take out, because these areas are probably too small to get in here to cut it out, and the other areas didn't reach down to that surface. So it's done a fantastic job in figuring out what needs to be removed. However, you can see here that we do have a couple of areas where that flat end mill could not reach, because it's obviously way too small, that area for that surface to reach. So I'm going to teach you a really sneaky little shortcut on how to clear these areas out without changing any of the tools that we've used already. So I've only used two tools, the 90-degree V-bit and also the 3.175 end mill. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to trick my CNC to thinking that they're using a really thin end mill. That's the thin end mill that I'm going to come in here. It's kind of a fake end mill that I'm going to be using to come in here and clean these sections out. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use the tool of the 90-degree V-bit to simulate that really fine tool to come and clean these areas out. Okay, so the next part is to use an adaptive clearing. So for the adaptive clearing, I'm going to select, and I've created a fake tool here. Now this is a 0.05mm flat end mill. You can see how tiny that is down here. So if I just go into that, tool, let's have a look at it. Let's go edit tool. You can see I've just called it a fake tool at the moment. Because it's so fine and so small, so it's 0.5 of a millimeter, and I'm not actually going to be using a fine tool like this. I'm going to be using my V-bit tool. So if you imagine there is a 90-degree V-bit here, I'm going to use a V-bit tool to use for this toolpath. Now I'm going to be using this one because it doesn't actually recognize a V-bit tool as a valid tool for an adaptive clearing. So that's why I have to make a fake tool for it. So essentially what the V-bit's going to do, I'm going to join both of these toolpaths together, and after it's gone through it and completed the chamfer or the V-bit carving, it's going to go through and simulate what this really fine bit is going to do to clear away any excess parts that it's missing. So once again, geometry, I'm going to use this area here. So I'm going to use the rest machining. So it's going to figure out from this previous toolpath, which is a 2D pocket, I was using a 3.175mm end mill, and it's going to figure out what it couldn't cut out. So I'm going to once again select that base, just in case it's going to throw any errors. In passes, stock to leave, once again I have to set it the same as what I had previously for the pass toolpath, so I can figure out the border around that chamfered area, and then the rest is going to be fine. So fingers crossed this is going to work. Well, there we go. So as you can see here that this 0.5mm has been able to reach in most of these areas here, which the V-bit is going to be replaced for that toolpath, and it's going to come in and complete any areas that are not cleared out. So I'm going to simulate that just to show you really quickly. So there's the vbit toolpath coming in on its first depth, and it's going to come through and do another depth. That's the 3.175 mil, and then that last little bit to come in here and clean out any areas, including these really tiny little area over here. I mean, I could make that toolpath even smaller if I wanted to. Also that tool bit to come in here a bit further, but I'm not going to worry too much because timber, it's so easy just to pre-sand those tiny little bits out. You probably won't see it anyway. So I've kind of finished what I needed to do here for my setting up my tool paths, and what I'm going to do now is when I actually run this on the machine, I'm going to start with my pocketing first. So it will go through and clear out those large areas which I don't need that material in to start with, and so it's not going to put as much pressure onto the V-bit when it comes through and starts cutting. So I'm firstly going to export the 2D pocket, and then the next one I'm going to group both by holding down Control, the Engraved 2 and Adaptive 2. And I'm going to right click, I'm going to export those together. So essentially when I go post process and then I'll save it out, it's going to run the first one, the 2 passes, and then go through and clean this area out. Actually, there was one other thing that I wanted to do, is a final pass with the V-bit, just do a cleaning pass. So what I'm going to do really quickly, I'm just going to duplicate this toolpath here. I'm just going to put it at the end. But what I'm going to do is, instead of doing multiple depths, I'm just going to turn that one off. So essentially what I'm going to get it to do is do the first pass of 2 passes is going to go through and clean those little corner bits up, and then it's going to go through once again and do a full pass just to make sure there's no areas that it didn't clean up very well. So I'm going to click those 3 tool paths, right click and post process, and then let's go down to the machine and see how this one turns up. Now I think both of these are certainly valid ways of doing the relief carving for logos and text. There are a couple of things to keep an eye out for, some pros and cons of both. So probably the best part about this one is that it's really quick to do, and you do end up having a really nice clean finish, which is hard to come in here and sand. However, there could be some issues with cutting with the vbit tool, where pieces might become dislodged if they're sitting by themselves outside the main part of the stock. The second part about this, which you might find a bit of an issue, is to get two pieces of stock that are the same size, especially if you want to go for some really nice timber where it might just be coming in a slab itself and you can't separate them. So this way is certainly one of those ones where if you're using two pieces of timber that are already cut to size, you can save a lot of time and money doing it this way. However, this for me has just come out beautifully, and I'm really happy with the final outcome of this carving. And this is my go-to type of carving if I'm to do this 45 or 90 degree V-bit carving around itself. So I hope you've learnt a lot in today's video, and don't forget to subscribe, give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you next time.